Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski. Today on the podcast, we're back in Colorado with one of the most amazing careers in running and one of the most amazing lives. If you haven't ever heard of or met Lorraine Moller, you're in for a treat. She has an amazing life story, amazing success. Let me just throw some highlights out there to whet your appetite. I'll put links where you can read about her whole career. National record holder at 1,500 meters. National best time in the marathon, winner of Boston Marathon, winner of several marathons, international, including in Japan, Olympic bronze medalist. There's a lot more. Welcome today on the podcast, Lorraine.
Thank you, Matthew.
Lorraine, let's start with the very beginnings. Where were you born?
I was born in a small town in New Zealand called Pataruru, which is pretty much in the center of the North Island.
Now, we'll get as personal as you'll let us today. I know that you had some challenges in your childhood.
Yes, look, I was the third of 6 children. We had a very outdoors life, which was typical of New Zealand in those days. It was the time where your mum kicked you out of the house in the morning and said, go off, the sun's shining, you're not allowed to be inside. And so we'd roam the farmlands around and get into trouble, and we'd come home when somebody broke an arm or we got hungry. So that was my childhood, very active, very connected to the land and nature, etc. I got a kidney bladder infection from about the time I was a year and a half old. I was in and out of hospital. The infection would flare up. I became immune to the antibiotics at the time. Several times I was sent home where there was nothing they could do for me. Those are the things that's in your childhood that shape your life and become reference points for you to engage in certain things. So there were times when I felt very lonely, long periods in hospital. When I entered high school, I got into running, and we always did athletics day where the kids would once a week at the club, and we would run barefoot on a grass track, and we'd do a 50-yard sprint and a 100-yard sprint. And that was pretty fun, but I wasn't the best at it. So I'd often get third or fourth, something like that. Maybe that third is burned into my brain. But anyway, when I got to high school and we graduated, so now at the athletic club, we're allowed to run the 440 yards. And I got in that 440 yards and I beat the girls who beat me in the sprints. And that was it. I was sold. I was on my way. And Matthew, I often talk about it wasn't something that I felt like I chose. I felt like destiny just came and took me and put me on this path. And it was an absolute freedom for me.
That's nice. You were successful. And was it being successful? Was it beating others? Was it competitive drive? What were the things that you felt when that happened?
It was all those things. I think probably being a third child and feeling like the underdog a lot of the time, that was my chance to shine. Here I am. Another wonderful thing that happened at that time was my dad, who was a World War II veteran, I think suffered from PTSD. He would often head off to the pub, and there were a few times he'd come home drunk, and he could be very critical. And I didn't know my dad. I didn't have a really like a close relationship to my dad, I think because of that, and maybe the other kids as well. But my dad, when he saw me running, he decided to start running with me and to accompany me. So he came on longer and longer runs, and he got fit, and it pulled him out of that whole culture that he was in. He actually gave up drinking altogether. He became a marathon runner. He ran miles and miles in the forest. So we would drive out to this huge forestry area around my town. We'd get lost in there. My dad had a terrible sense of direction, so we ended up doing some really fantastically long runs, and be in the middle of nowhere and find a house somewhere, somebody living in the middle of nowhere, and we'd go over, and they'd have to get on the phone was with the exchange. They'd have to ring and try and get a hold of my mother and try to explain where we were, and for her to come and pick us up. And that happened quite a few times. So that was absolutely fabulous for our endurance.
That's brilliant. It didn't take long for you to become up through the ranks of New Zealand athletes and appear on the national stage. Was it age 14?
14, I was running in the national 800 meters, 880 yards in those days. I ran my first national champs when I was 14 years old. I made the final. I think I ran like 2:13. That sort of set me on a course. Now, the women were 10, 12, 18 years older than me. That set me on the course. I represented New Zealand for the first time when I was 16 years old. It just kept on snowballing from that point on.
Let me ask you what it was like then. Let's say those ages 14 to 16. You're a elite athlete already at this time, but what is it like for athletes as women then? What is it like for runners then? What's the state of the sport?
So you have to remember at that time that the longest distance in the Olympics for women in track and field was the 1500 meters. It wasn't considered something that women should do or could do. We were definitely the fairer sex, and it was a man's world that we were in. There wasn't all these wonderful colors and women's shoes and women's clothing and all that kind of stuff. No concessions for the women. We were considered the second-class citizens of the sport. But I was treated well. I didn't know that or have a feeling that I was discriminated against. It's just the way it was. And so I accepted that, and I really welcomed the opportunities that I had. And it was a wonderful world. It began to change very quickly in the 60s. I think that once a woman had the pill and they were free from reproductive things, that there was this rapid evolution of women into men's domains. Not that affected me then as a teenager, but that was the climate.
Let me ask a couple more things about your journey there at that early age. Apart from the joyous running with your dad, relationship building, and getting in shape, what coaching did you have?
Yes, we had a club. Every little town in New Zealand had a club, and the club would put on these races, and it would all be volunteer, and it was very much a community spirit, and they were very popular because we didn't have TV all the time, etc. I was coached by, first of all, my phys ed teacher. Then I was introduced to one of Arthur Lydiard's disciples, and his wife. I used to run with them, and they gave me my first training program, which my dad and I did. And then the club introduced me to John Davies. John Davies was a 1500 meter medalist and one of Arthur Lydiard's original group of runners. He lived 15 miles away, and they invited him over and introduced me to him because they considered that I had a talent that needed the more expert coaching of somebody who was trained under Lydiard, because Lydiard was like God when it came to training in those days. And so John coached me for all those developmental years from about the age of 15 on through my teenagers to the Commonwealth Games in 1984 in the 800 meters. And he would come on weekends now and then, and he would write me letters. So I have a bunch of letters with my training program that he wrote every week and would check on me, and he would phone Arthur Lydiard and just double check what he was doing with me, because he didn't know what to do with a girl. They hadn't coached a girl back
That's
then,
great.
and they didn't
What
want to
was
train me. Yeah.
what was your vision of what would become? You're 16 years old. When was the first time you got on a plane and competed outside of New Zealand? And what was your vision of what you could become?
My first trip was in Australia, and that was absolutely fabulous because I was competing against the Australians. So that, and being in a group, a team, was such a camaraderie, and the men were wonderful. They really looked after us. I was really full of it. And by the time I came home, I had improved my best 800 meters time. That was my event as a 16-year-old. I came home from that with a 2:05.1. So I was on my way, and it was pretty exciting. But just to back up a little bit, Matthew, when I was 14, I ran in a district championships in the 440 yards on a grass track. I was lined up against these older women, and I just went like hell, and I won the race. And I ran, I think, under 59 seconds for that 440 yards. And I beat these women, which was something that I shouldn't have really done, but I didn't know. I was just going heck. Our team captain came up to me, and he was a very official sort of man, and he was like the head of the federation and all this sort of stuff, and he lived in our hometown. Mr. Drummond came up to me and he said, "One day you will go to the Olympics." And he sowed that little seed in my head, and that became a prophecy, I think, because his words were so powerful, and he seemed like such a powerful man. He wore a blazer, and he had an insignia on his blazer and all the symbols of power. And I didn't even have much interest in the Olympics. I didn't really know what they were. I knew they were a big deal because New Zealand had Arthur Lydiard and his guys that had won these gold medals in the 60s. And they were like the movie stars of New Zealand. And so I knew that, but yeah, it came to fruition. And it's really amazing how you can, as an elder, what influence you can have on people with your words. And unfortunately, young people are often influenced maybe in a negative way and put on that path. But coaches have this ability to really raise the level and recognize potential in people. And
That's great. He was certainly right. We'll probably not discuss all the amazing things, but he was certainly right. Not only did you make it to the Olympics 4 times, get on the podium, you probably exceeded even what his vision was. And I'd like to mix in as it comes up the view of professionalism, because I know you played a role in breaking through barriers all through your life, including that one of professionalism. We'll get to that when it comes up naturally here talking. But was there any view of what this running was coming as you become 16, 18 years old with this continued success? This vision that this was going to be your life, that this was a way you could pursue a career?
there was not a professional woman athlete, was nothing that existed at that time. Okay. Let alone a career as an athlete, let alone professional. I became a school teacher. I went to phys ed school and became a phys ed teacher because that was the closest thing to sporty that a sporty girl could do. I taught for 2 years in a country school. I hated it because I really wanted to be running. At the end of that period, I met an American at a marathon. And now I hated the marathon. I thought that the marathon was the event that people ran because they were too slow for the track. So I was a track snob. And Arthur Lydiard had this American that came over for this international marathon, and he was running in it. And I was set up as a blind date for the banquet afterwards with him by a friend of mine. And it just so happened that I had broken off an engagement. That's why I was up in Auckland that weekend. I was supposed to be getting married, but I just could not do it. I could not do the school teacher, the conveyor belt that was set out for a woman at that time. And so I broke this poor guy's heart at the time, I think, and called off the wedding. Ended up in Auckland on a blind date with this American who was running in the marathon. And we hit it off, and he'd been to the Olympics. He had everything that just was just so fantastic that I couldn't believe my luck. And he invited me to come to Minneapolis. He had been to the 1968 Olympics in the marathon. So I took up the invitation and landed on his doorstep. And that opened up a whole new world to me. Now, here we were going to races every weekend, and this road running thing was gathering its momentum just at the beginning stages of it. There weren't many women running and things, but I would go along with this group of guys and jump in races. I ran my first 5K race, then my first 10K race. I ran a 10-mile race, then a 20-mile race. That's the Sit-in-Demai race, a really hilly race from Stoughton to Madison, I think. And I was running really well. I ran under 2 hours for that 20 miles. It culminated in this Grandma's Marathon where everyone was going. And I went, oh, don't leave me behind. I'm having too much fun with you all. I'll come and I'll run this marathon. And I went, oh, I do a 20-mile run on a Sunday as part of my training. I'll run the first 20 miles. So they arranged for a ride for me at the 20-mile mark. So I get in this race. I'm running. I'm at the 20-mile mark. I'm at Lemon Drop Hill. The car is waiting there for me. And I go, I feel pretty good. It's only 6 more miles to the finish. A lot of it's downhill. I might win a prize. I'll keep going. So I waved them away and off I went, and I ran to the finish. And I ran 2:37 for the marathon, and I won it. And the woman, there weren't hardly any other women in it anyway. I thought everybody's making a big fuss about the marathon, but it still didn't mean much to me. I didn't want to be labeled as a marathoner, as a slow old marathoner.
At some point in your career, I think 10 or 15 years ago, you were in the top 10 all time in New Zealand from every distance from 800 through the marathon. And at some point you held the fastest marathon time for a Kiwi female, right?
Probably, yes. Yeah. I had some good competition. I was blessed with a couple of really great rivals from New Zealand. And one of them was Alison Rowe. Alison got into the marathon. She won Boston in 83, I think. She had broken 2:30 for the marathon. So she might have been the fastest one. But I went to Grandma's Marathon and I went, if Alison's broken 2:30, then I have to break 2:30. So that was my goal. And I did. I don't think I ran faster than Alison. But anyway, having rivals, you just use each other to move up. You probably had that experience with your running group, right?
Sure. Were you logging your workouts and mileage?
Oh, yeah, but by wristwatch. Or you'd look at the kitchen clock on your way out, and then you'd look at it when you came back in, and then you'd divide it by 7 or divide it by 8 or whatever and add up a miles. But it was probably not accurate at all.
So all the way through there, you're running training in terms of minutes per mile was guesswork that you remembered from the track.
Yeah, and it didn't really matter. But yes, I kept very careful logs. I did all this conversion, and then you'd add up how many miles you did at the end. And so my boyfriend was a real disciple of Lydiard, Ron Dawes. He was a 68 Olympian, and he was really insistent that you keep this careful record. And he would go over how I added up. And if I'd fudged it to make 100 miles and he'd go, no, you only ran 98 and a half miles. Get your gear on. You've got to go out and do the other mile and a half, and I'd go, that's stupid, and he'd say, no, you got to do it. So.
What about some of your training runs when you were training with various people? Was there competition? Were there any other women in your training groups?
No, I trained with men mostly. Yeah. Or I ran alone. I didn't have many women runners, not until I came to Boulder in 82. And then with the Olympics, a lot more people started coming and using Boulder as a jumping off spot. Many of them stayed. And we had a truly international group. And there were a lot more women that I was competitive with. So I would train with them now and then. Yeah, I had some really good training partners. One of them was Barbara Moore. She was a New Zealander. She was more of a track runner. She won a bronze medal in the 1990 Commonwealth Games in the 5,000 meters.
You also won a medal in the Commonwealth Games. That was in the 1500?
Yeah, in 82 in Brisbane, I ran the 1,500 meters and got the bronze medal, and I ran the 3,000 meters and got the bronze medal.
That's
And
right.
then I got a silver medal in the marathon in the 1986 Games in Edinburgh.
Let's talk about that end of your self-vision as solely a track runner. When did you say, okay, I'm going to concentrate on the marathon? Because you had a winning streak where no one could beat you in the marathon for a while.
Yes, I won this Grandma's Marathons. That was the first little crack in my track runner's idea of myself. Then I got invited to this Avon Women's World Championship race that was put together by Catherine Switzer. It was meant as a showcase to the Olympics committees to show that women could fulfill the criteria for inclusion in the Olympics towards 84. And it was a long shot to go from 1,500 meters to the marathon. But anyway, she pulled it off. She was absolutely incredible with what she was able to achieve. So she gathered all the top women marathoners, and I made that list because of that Grandma's Marathon that I'd done. So I get this invitation to go to London. You can bring your boyfriend. You get to stay at a hotel. You get a expenses all paid trip. All you have to do is run a marathon. I went, wow, what a great deal. This is fantastic. But I still thought it was like a long training run. This was in August. So then coming up in June, I went, oh, I better see if I can still run a marathon. So I went back to the Grandma's Marathon. I ran it again as a training run. I ran a little bit slower. I ran 2:38. And I went, okay, yeah, I can still run the marathon. I feel confident. So off we went to London. A race was 80 women from around the world. Joan Benoit was in there, Joyce Smith, anybody who was a who's who, and stood on the start line, and we all took off. And it was the first time the streets of London had ever been closed for a sporting event. And it was quite a spectacle. So people came out, what are these women doing running around in their underwear, basically? It was quite a warm day. It was in the 70s. And I knew that I had to drink water, but I had no experience of how to do that. They had water stations with Dixie cups, and of course grab it while I was running and throw it over my shoulder and throw it into my face, and it was end up with maybe a couple of drops. So then I decided what I had to do was just walk. So I'd get to the station, I'd stop, I would walk, stop, have a drink, and then I'd have to sprint on to catch up the pack. That was the way that I ran the race. And eventually I got into the lead and I won it. That was another breakthrough moment because it was such a big deal. Now I was on the front page of all the papers and all the rest, and it's, yeah, okay, maybe. But I would always assert my track credentials first. However, Matthew, I got a phone call about a year later and from Catherine, who was very excited. She said, "We did it. We're in the Olympics." So that door opened, and it opened my Olympic career. Now, I had qualified for the Olympics in the 1500 meters. However, I was not selected because I had run with men and done the time with men, so that was considered unacceptable. The whole bureaucracy of the sport really bogged things or limited things in certain ways, and especially for the women. And with this marathon opening, and now I had these wins under my belt, I started to get invitations to all sorts of places. I went down to Brazil and ran in the first marathon that they had there, and was having heck of a time with these exotic trips.
What was your expectation? You had beaten Joan Benoit. You had beaten everybody, the top women in the world. So what was your expectation when you got to the games?
Yeah, the Olympic Games for me was the pinnacle of everything. And I was quite confident about going out in a marathon and being able to win, which I did. I won my first 9 marathons. But the Olympics was up there in my mind. And it was something that I saw myself. I finished 5th in that race. And when I finished, you know when you've given it your all, or you've thrown caution to the wind and you haven't held anything back. But I didn't feel that way because I knew there was a point in the race where I gave it away and played safe. And so I had a sort of level of disappointment. But what I did was I called myself the best of the rest. So here I had Joan Benoit, Greta Weitz, Rosa Mota, Ingrid Christensen, me. So in my mind, there was like this group here, and then I'm right here. And it took me a long time to break through that at the Olympic level.
Let's jump ahead for a quick story because I know in 1992 they put together all the things you love best: heat, hills, and humidity for Barcelona. How did you approach getting ready for that Olympic marathon in your 4th Olympics?
Oh, you mentioned the 3 H's, and they're the 3 things that I hated about marathons. Nobody wants to run a marathon in the heat. It's miserable. You're better off sitting on the beach and having a margarita, right? And I didn't like hills. I didn't like uphills. I was good on the downhills. I was a great downhill runner, but I didn't have confidence on the hills. I didn't like running uphill. Then the humidity, and here's me living in Boulder and really enjoying it with very low humidity. A year before, I went over to Barcelona and went over the course, and I found that it had all those things I hated. So it was really hot, really humid, and it finished up a hill. So it had Montjuïc, the stadium, on the top of this little mountain in the town. So as you got closer to the finish, you started going up in the hill. And I realized that if I am going to win my dream of standing on the podium, which I used to imagine doing the victory pose, that I had to somehow get my mind around those 3 things. I had to learn to at least accept them, hopefully love them. So I set about with a program doing just that. And I live here in Boulder. There's big hills just down the road. So I chose a big hill and I finished all of my runs up that hill. And I imagined that the Olympic Stadium was at the top and I'm running up, and here I am coming into the stadium. Yay, I did it. So I'd wave my arms in the air, which I hope not too many people are watching. But anyway, and I lay it up So created my own internal humidity system. And so I did heat training, trained in the middle of the day. So that's hills, heat and humidity. Yeah.
And you would train in sweatpants right?
Yeah. And a sweat
Sweatsuit?
jacket. Yeah.
At what point after London did you learn the hydration skills? You weren't walking in the next 9 marathons at the drink stop.
No, I didn't stop and walk. So when I ran my first 2:30, under 2:30 at Grandma's Marathon, which was my third one, and I was running against this masters runner, Alex Rattel, and Alex was a medical doctor. He was an anesthesiologist, and he said, Lorraine, when the tissues get dehydrated, they're like tissue paper and they just fall apart. So he was really big on hydration. So I did a few runs with him and we were about the same level. Alex really wanted to break 2:30 and so did I. He would stash all his water bottles along the route and etc. So we were running at this Grandma's Marathon together, and he stopped at the station to have a drink of water and I went, to hell with it. I'm not stopping for a drink of water because I want to get my time. So I just ran right through the water stops, finished the race, and I broke 2:30 and he didn't. I thought that water was probably overrated. I found it really hard. If I drank much, I just want to throw up. And in fact, in London, with all that water that I took, I was throwing up. And it's really horrible when you're in the front. You've got a double-decker bus with all these journalists on it. And they've got a big banner that says Avon, the beauty of woman in motion. And you're going, I'm gonna projectile vomit and ruin all their photos. But anyway, that was a problem for me. So I didn't take a lot of water. There were times when I tried drinks and they would always just upset my stomach. I could not take a drink with anything in it much. What I did come to do eventually was I would have at the 20-mile mark some water with a tiny bit of defizzed Coca-Cola in it, just a couple of ounces. And I'd look so forward to it. I'd get that at 20 miles. I'd get that down and have a little bit of caffeine and boom, I'd be off to the finish. And you don't know how much of this is psychological, but maybe a placebo effect, but they work together. And boy, I really look forward to that. So I figured that was what I could manage. Now in the Olympics, you had to take water. It's just too hot. I had terrible trouble in Seoul getting my drink, because you can imagine they have a couple of drink stops with everybody with their special drinks out on these tables, and you've got a whole pack coming by and everyone heading for this flurry of arms and legs, and people trip up, etc., trying to get their bottles. I kept grabbing the wrong bottle, and there was even some of the runners that would sprint, and as they grabbed their bottle, they would knock off every other person's bottle.
Yeah, that seems horrible.
Yeah, you get tough. You learn that people and women can be pretty ruthless, especially at that level, and dealing with cheats and all the rest. It's you got to get hardened in that world.
Many of us, probably almost everybody's dreamed of championship and winning and maybe being at the Olympics. Talk about the end of the race in 92 in the Olympic marathon.
Oh,
the last
gosh.
4 miles. What do you recall?
I'll tell you, when going to the start of the marathon and at the Olympics, and it's such a horrible thing. I'd go, why do I put myself through this? Why do I do this? This is just horrible. I feel like I'm going to my execution, my own public execution. It was just terrible. But then once you get going, and this was in Barcelona particularly, because I can remember it so crisply, that first of all, it was so hot when we got to the start, and we were delivered there about 3 hours before the start. into a little compound where there was no shade, just the sun beating down and all these women runners. And some of them were so nervous that they started warming up like a couple of hours before their race. And you go, oh gosh. When Arthur Lydiard had told me, this is right before Barcelona, and I'd had dinner with him in Boulder, and he said, Lorraine, you've got to remember that 90% of people at the Olympics perform below their best. And I went,
Really?
wow, that's quite a statistic. And he left me with it. I went away thinking about it, and I thought, okay, if there's 80 people in the race and 90% eliminate themselves, that means I'm racing against 8 people if I perform up to my best, and most of those people I can probably beat. So then my odds suddenly in my own mind went up really high. But the interesting thing, Matthew, is I put myself in the 10% that are going to perform well. I didn't think of myself in the 90% that was going to mess up. But the other thing is that I think Arthur made that statistic up.
That's great.
Yeah.
Where do you think you were in the age group of the runners in that race?
Oh, I was the oldest in the race.
You were
Yeah.
37, right? You were the
Yes.
eldest in the race. Wow.
Yes. Yes. And nobody rated me a chance because I'd been around too long, and they all went, if she was going to do it, she would have done it by now. In fact, what happened with my shoe sponsor, which was Mizuno, would not renew my contract because I was too old before that race. Yes.
Wow, what a great corporate decision that was.
Yeah, that was wonderful because I got to wear whatever shoes I wanted. I tried on shoes. I went with the shoes that I liked. I had a really nice little pair of Brooks shoes that I paid for. I bought them.
Wow.
And so that was one thing that happened in Barcelona. Another thing that happened was that one of my arch rivals retired. That was Anne Ordain. She was such a fantastic athlete. And we were always like, it really mattered to us who was in front or how each other did. So we always had that rivalry. But when she retired, it's released me, I think, from that comparison. And so that was another freedom. And then the other thing that happened was my ex-husband, he died a couple of days before the race.
Was it that? It was
Yeah.
that soon before.
Yeah, and the day before the race, and my team had tried to keep the news from me. They didn't want me to be upset in any way. The day before the race, one of the Americans came up to me and said, oh, did you hear about Ron? And I go, well, what about Ron? Oh, he had a heart attack. I went, how is he? And they said, no, he died. And I went, oh, gosh. And I had left on bad terms. We were a horrible divorce. And I'd always thought that I would meet up with him sometime and we would settle our differences, etc. So it's not a nice feeling to finish off a relationship that way. And here I am at the Olympics. And actually, there was a thought, I hate to say this, Matthew, but there was a thought that went through my head that said, he did it.
He got one less zinger in.
Yeah. And so then I had to where do I put this? The day before my race, in my constellation of things, how am I going to arrange my world around this huge piece of information for me? And I went and sat on the pier at Barcelona, and I had a little talk with him in my mind, and I was thinking the great thing that he did was he set me on my marathon career. He taught me so much about the marathon, how to prepare for it. I think he was probably over the top sometimes. He made me do over distance runs, 28-mile runs. I think they were a bit much. But anyway, I went, and he was also one of those he made the Olympics and heat trained. He was the guy who could prepare for the odds and rise to the occasion and use that to his advantage. And I went, okay, I'm going to take all those things that he taught me, take the pearls from that relationship and use them to my advantage in the race tomorrow. And I think that was probably the thing that got me off that 5th platform at the Olympics and got me onto the podium.
What do you remember coming in up the last hill into the stadium?
The course started out at the beach and went through the town. What I came to recognize is that in my mind, because it's when you're running the marathon and your mind starts to go, oh, maybe I'm not feeling so good. And then suddenly you don't feel so good. Then you start dropping behind and you go, oh, what do I do? And then you drop further behind and next thing you've lost the race. So you've got to be on top of that mind because it plays all these tricks with you. And what I've found in a race, especially in the marathon, that there's a point where you get to a crossroads where you really have to like put it on the line or you're not going to get what you want. And it takes an act of courage of stepping this threshold into that area and taking that risk. And it takes courage. And I knew that point would come, and it usually comes somewhere after the 20-mile mark. But for me this time, it came at the 16-mile mark, and we were going down Los Ramblas, which is a very long, famous street in Barcelona. And the race had broken apart. And this East German woman, no, the Russian woman, she had taken it out and thrown down the gauntlet. And there was a pack that was chasing her. And I was with a couple of Japanese runners, East German, etc. We were giving chase to her. And I remember this little voice sitting on my shoulder and going, Lorraine, what do you think you're doing? I'm giving chase. And it says, why are you doing that? And I go, because if I don't, because I want to win. And this voice is, but it's really hot and it's really soon. There's still 10 miles to go. And I go, I don't feel really hot. And if I don't cover the move, I'm not going to be in the running. And this voice said, yeah, but it starts going uphill, started to pull out all the heat, the humidity, the uphill, all those things, and was working on me. And I'm having this little conversation in my head and I'm going, and it says, this voice says, you're in third place at the moment. And it says, third place is really good. If you go too hard now, you might blow it. And there's a part of me that went, oh yeah, you're right. And I slowed down at that point and I let the two runners get me at that point. And then we went up the hill and we all stayed in those places and entered the stadium. Now, I've got to tell you, it was then night. We were running in the dark up this hill. I couldn't see the runners up above anymore. And this stadium, lit up stadium, like this beacon that we're running towards, it was absolutely surreal. And then you come in and you go through the tunnel and you burst out into this stadium and there's 80,000 people cheering. It was just phenomenal. It just gives me goosebumps even talking about it. It's electrifying, absolutely amazing. And they're cheering and you're the center of attention for the whole world in that moment. And I finished third and I could see the first and second, and they were doing a victory lap. And I stood there for a while and I went, can I do a victory lap? I'm only third. Am I allowed to do a victory lap because I'm third? And then I went, I'll never get another chance. And so I followed the other two. If the second runner hadn't been doing a victory lap, I wouldn't have, but I did. I followed and did my victory lap. And it was just amazing. I would say one of the greatest highlights of my life up to that point. Yeah.
Do you remember who you talked to first, apart from the competitors after that race?
As we were ushered back into the tunnel, there was people hanging over and trying to get your attention and trying to say hello. And yeah, I remember there were a few agents trying to push their cards onto me.
Mizuno Shoe Company trying to take us back.
I want to be, yeah. Oh, I want to represent you. I can get you. And I'm like, oh, just hang on a minute. Yeah, sign on the line. I've got the contract here already. So yeah, those were probably the first people. Then I had some of my team officials who got to accompany me, and Everyone was ecstatic. It was really wonderful. Then I had to do a drug test. You've got to pee in a cup, and after you've run a marathon in the heat, it just takes forever. So we were hours just waiting there, and then eventually got back to the village. And I remember getting to my bed, and I'm just lying there, so buzzed, so just full of adrenaline and euphoria. And I just staring at the ceiling all night, just going, wow, you did it. You did it. That was, yeah, and just the most amazing experience.
It's fantastic. That's a great story. Thanks for telling it like that. It was very fun to be there with you through that telling. What a great experience and what a great retelling. That's the end of part 1 with Lorraine Moller. But there's lots more to her story. We'll be back in part 2 to talk about life after the 92 Olympics and reflect back on the breaking of the professionalism barrier and so much more. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.